All right, so this is the last, let's say, substantial session of the open forum, and it's just an evidence that time flies when you're having fun. Before we start, I would like to ask you all to please fill in our satisfaction survey. You find it in the app on the main page. I think there's a picture there. Oh yeah, that's a picture of the survey, but you find it on the home page of the app. And while it's very nice to know what you thought of this event, what we're most interested in is what we should talk about next time, because we're planning to do this again. And all your suggestions and ideas for exciting topics is very, very welcome. The other announcement I would like to make is that we made a slight change in the program now for this afternoon. So we're going to do this session now as planned and as in the program, but we will skip the coffee break, or rather we will move the coffee break. We'll do a very short closing session, just some reflections from Edwin and some announcements, and then we'll make sure that coffee is available for you afterwards instead. So those who need to leave a little bit early, don't miss the closing remarks, and you still have a chance to drink coffee and network. And that's the introduction from my side. So now the session is on just transition. This is a new and exciting topic for World Steel, and I'm happy to introduce my colleague Sue, who is our head of people sustainability, and I'm sure she will tell you more about that. Welcome, Sue.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that our lunch has recharged our energy, and then we are ready to embark on the final leg of our discussion with a renewed energy and inspiration. Okay, this final session is about the just transition, people and a sustainable future. It is pivotal for shaping the future of steel industry. I hope, and you agree with that, the topics we discuss and the questions we ask today will help us set the directions going forward, which will have significant impact on our people and most likely all of us here today. Yesterday, the OECD report indicated that both companies and countries have given limited attention to the topic of just transition, and steel was not an exception. Unfortunately, I have to agree with that observation based on my research on this topic in preparation of this session. And we will also have hear more about how steel companies addressing this topic from one of the speakers later on. And what I hope is the limited attention becomes a thing of the past. The fact that we are having this session today demonstrates the growing focus within the steel industry on the just transition topic, and that we are committed to giving this topic our fullest attention today. We are already doing better than yesterday, and then tomorrow we will do better than today. Let me put some base for our discussions. The direction and the ambition of achieving net zero goals have been widely embraced and broadly accepted. That has been the discussions from the past 2 years, and then yesterday and this morning. Now the focus is shifting towards the potential social and the other impacts of the climate change. This shift is effectively captured by the concept of just transition, which emphasizes the need for an equitable and inclusive approach to addressing these impacts. The concept just transition originated in the 1970s and was used in a movement by US trade unions in the 1980s to protect workers from the new environmental regulations. It has recently gained prominence in the context of climate change due to the uneven impact of the climate change itself, but also the measures to mitigate the impact. The definition provided by the International Labour Organization offers a quite clear framework and is widely referenced in the discussions about just transition. So I will read it out a little bit. Greening the economy in a way that is as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. The urgency around just transition is growing because of the escalating impact of climate change and the narrowing window for effective actions for us. It has become central to achieving climate goals fairly and inclusively. We hear a lot of the terms fair, inclusively, equitable in our discussions. As we begin our discussion on this topic for the first time, we have many questions to ask, topics to discuss, and approaches to explore. And today's session is crucial for setting our directions and mapping our pathways for the future. So what does just transition mean for the steel industry? What does it entail? Where does the steel industry stand regarding just transition? What are the key challenges? How can we address them? I keep going with the questions. How can we strike a balance between the imperative to reduce carbon emissions and the imperative to safeguard jobs and the communities? What measures can be implemented to ensure equitable distribution of the benefits of a just transition among all affected communities and key stakeholders? How can international cooperation and policy alignment be fostered to support a global just transition in the steel industry? Last question. What insights can we learn from countries that have made significant strides in greening their steel industries? So many questions. So before we invite our speakers to delve into these questions, let me provide some context on the people impacted by this transition. You're looking at the key stakeholders of the steel industry: employees, communities, suppliers, and consumers. The transition will impact them in one way or another. The depth and the weight of the impact will vary among these groups, with each experiencing different positive and negative impacts. So the varying impacts will require tailored approaches and solutions. Embracing the principle that no one should be left behind, the steel industry must collaborate with all of them to address the differences effectively and work together to achieve a transition that is inclusive, fair, and sustainable. Many people believe that business is about profit, but actually it is about people. Let's look at the climate change through the lens of people during this session. Let's take a moment to talk about the topic of employment and the steel industry and grasp the magnitude of the potential impact in my last slide. According to the report, the role of steel manufacturing in the global economy that was commissioned by worldsteel and published by the Oxford Economics in 2019, the steel industry employed over 6 million people worldwide in 2017. The report also calculated that the far-reaching supply chain of the steel industry also supported some 40 million people globally. That means every 2 jobs within the steel industry, an additional 13 jobs were sustained through its supply chain. The report also estimated that through its customer activities, the industry indirectly supported an additional 49 million jobs worldwide. With the steel industry contributing 3.8% to the annual global GDP, the report concludes that the steel industry supported and facilitated a total of 96 million jobs around the world. Our own data collection on the number of employees of our member companies shows a steady workforce for the last decade. Therefore, I believe the numbers from 2017 remains highly relevant. The figure of 96 million does not include the number of still connected and supported jobs in the communities. So what we can see is that the size would be much, much bigger when we just talk about the scale of the people. So with this figure in mind, let's begin our discussion. Let me have our speakers to come on to the stage. So Ajanta, Sangeeta, and Luis, please come on the board. We have 4 speakers today. Patrick Correa from Industry Oil Global Union is joining us online. Can you put him? Yeah. And then we have Ajanta Chatterjee, Chair of the People Committee at worldsteel, but also the Global Head of Organizational Development and DEI Talent of JSW Steel, and Luisa Costa from World Benchmarking Alliance, and Sangeeta Raja Selvaraju from Just Transition Finance Lab of LSE. Patrick, we will begin with Patrick. You can see his face online. He's joining us from Switzerland. He would like to share his perspectives and some viewpoints on this important topic. Patrick?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to worldsteel for the invitation to address your conference. Unfortunately, I was not able to be with you physically, but I can at least be part online. So I am the director for base metals at Industrial Global Union. I have the honor to represent 50 million workers from 140 countries across the mining, energy, and manufacturing sectors. So this is a very important topic for industrial. We have been discussing the question of just transition for the last, I think, 6 or 7 years. For our unions and affiliates from everywhere, the shift to a low-carbon industry must not only be environmentally sustainable, but also socially equitable, as you were saying, Sue, in your introduction. Our interest in this transition is twofold. In one hand, we are committed to a significant reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. But on the other hand, we are adamant that this transition must not come at the expenses of the workers. The workers that we represent should not be the scapegoats for the economy and environmental transformation. They shouldn't bear the cost of this transition. Rather, they should benefit from it and be the key drivers of change. In our sense, that's why the trade unions are very important and play a crucial role in advocating for these policies that protects worker rights during the transition. We demand comprehensive social safety nets, including unemployment benefits and job placement service to ensure workers aren't left behind. Environment policies must also account for their social and economic impacts. Moreover, we must combat the practices of certain multinationals that seek state aids and use workers as leverage, creating more inequalities and fostering what we call an unjust transition so far. For our affiliates and unions, implementing robust training and reskilling programs is really essential and on the heart of a just transition. Workers must have access to training that allows them to acquire new skills for green jobs. This requires, of course, developing partnership with educational institutions and industries to create relevant training programs. Additionally, financial support and incentive must be provided to encourage workers to participate in these programs. Without skilled workers, the transition will not succeed at all. For industrial, it's part of our guidelines and demands that the workers and their unions are integrated into the planning and implementation of transition strategies through social dialogue and participation in decision-making processes with multinationals and governments. But so far we can say it has not happened. Only in a few cases the unions and workers have been part of the decision-making process. At the moment, only financial decisions are made without the worker participation. And this, in our sense, transparency and communication between employers and workers and policymakers are essential if we want to have a just transition. Unfortunately, as I was already saying, the workers and unions are too often related to managing the implementation of the decisions, often turning to firefighters dealing with a crisis. We are not involved in the process. That's why we think that the transition has been unjust so far. We would like also to emphasize that the economic benefits of the transition, as you were saying, Sue, must be distributed fairly. All stakeholders, especially workers, must benefit. This means advocating for profit-sharing mechanisms and other financial arrangements that benefit workers. It's crucial that the new green jobs offer wages and benefit comparable to the better than the one that they had before. Salaries in other industries should not be lower than those needed to attract and retain skilled workers in the green industry, especially in the steel. And so far, we have just been constating that in many companies, the wages are not enough to attract the workers and to attract them and keep in the jobs. And that's for us a problem if we want to address the question of the transition. Just to finish my first intervention on that, it's crucial to emphasize that workers should not bear the cost of this transition. Multinational corporations, especially the steel ones, must contribute fairly to the transition efforts. We believe that a truly just transition requires the active involvement of workers and their representatives in all decision-making processes. Our goal is to create a fair, sustainable future for all stakeholders in the steel industry. That's why Industrial urge all parties to collaborate to ensure that the transition to a low-carbon economy is just and equitable for all. Thank you, Sue.
Hello. Thank you, Patrick. It's really good to hear the perspectives of the workers, and then the industry global union is representing the value of our workers. We will take questions later on when we finish all the presentations from our speakers. So next I would like to invite Ajanta to present the industry perspective on this topic.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ajanta Chatterjee, and I am a OD and talent development professional, worked across industries, financial institutes, telecommunication, and currently with JSW Steel. My primary job is to help employees build capability for organization transformation. And today I'm going to focus on, for the next 6 to 7 minutes, on what we need to do as steel industry to help this transformation to be a success. Where we are at it today, are we proactive enough to build the skills which is required for the future? And are we mindful enough to build the roadmap to navigate the future, which is so uncertain for us? Sorry. Okay. and hence building capability to sustain the transformation. The focus is for, as Sue mentioned in her slide, the topmost block on the top are the employees. What are we doing today to help them navigate the uncertain future? The context we all know, the climate change and environmental degradation, reduce productivity, destroy jobs, and their effect falls disproportionately on the most vulnerable. And hence, while this will potentially create more jobs, but this requires a bold effort to invest in people's capability. And where we are today as an industry is something which we need to introspect. A current LinkedIn study on global skills shows that there is a difference between, a gap between the supply and demand. Growth in demand for green skills is outplacing the increase in supply. Share of workers with green skills is growing, but still only 1 in 8 workers have the required green skills. So 9.2% growth of jobs requiring at least 1 green skill from 2018 to 2023, but 5.4% growth of green talent per year from 2018 to 2023. So with this gap in green skills and with the increasing effort of transformation, what do we need to do and where do we need to put our focus? So there are 3 things that we need to do continuously. One is powering up the leadership for transformation, building the workforce for delivering the net zero portfolio, and building an inclusive culture. Why leadership? Surveys shows that most of the organization transformation for change, only 30% are successful. And the main reason of failure, 37% rests on employees' resistance to change and 33% on not enough management support to sustain this change. Management behavior not supportive of the change. And hence it is imperative that we help our leaders to make this transition effectively. What does the new leadership talk about? For the changing environment, as leadership of the steel community, CEOs must adeptly navigate corporate social responsibility, encompassing diversity, social justice, and sustainability. This should be the language of tomorrow. We cannot avoid it anymore. Industrial companies like us, traditionally male-dominated, face a challenge in aligning with values like DEI and sustainability, given the long-standing low representation of women in the workforce, as well as in the decision-making areas. And hence, we have to put discretionary effort in these areas with our leaders walking the talk most of the times. Who is a sustainable leaders? A research by Russell Reynolds Associate, who are one of the CXO hiring firms, talk about that a sustainable leader is the one who is purpose-driven. Belief that business is not a commercial activity divorced from wider societal and environmental context. And hence, it has to be stakeholder inclusion. It is not about stakeholder management anymore. How we are having dialogues with different opinions across the organization, across the ecosystem. Our leaders have to be disruptive innovations, challenging the traditional approaches and identifying novel solutions to do away with the trade-off between profitability and sustainability. And hence, how are they thinking about our future? Long-term activation, setting audacious goals, but also having the courage to sustain it and sticking around with it. Multi-level system thinking, recognizing the interconnectivity of the ecosystem, naturally curious with high levels of ambitions. So if we take our current steel leadership and put them under this lens, where would we find them? And if they are at a certain stage, certain level, doing certain things exceptionally well than the others, are we giving them enough exposure? Are we giving them enough experience so that they are becoming the sustainable leaders of tomorrow? So the blueprint of success is moving from the traditional leadership of command and control to becoming more collaborative, co-creating, talking about impact and solutioning, working along with the people rather than managing from the top. All the leaders who were questioned or interviewed during this study spoke predominantly about 4 things. Make it your passion. Build a purpose around it. Make it core to who you are. Sustainability is not something out there. It has to be within the ecosystem of the business strategy. Make it tangible. Have dialogues across employee level. Make them understand what it is in for them in this transition, and then be practical. Accept that there would be challenges, but how courageous are we to talk about it? So with the leadership, mindset changing, or we help them navigate this change by giving them requisite experience and exposure, how do we build the workforce for delivering the net zero portfolio? Now, this is an interesting study done by McKinsey, and they kind of interviewed the net zero workforce, the workforce of 18 to 24 years old. How can I go back? Okay, another one? Okay, so harnessing the enthusiasm. 78% of the respondents value contributing to net zero emissions, 57% interested in working for organization supporting the goal, and for those aged 18 to 24, tackling climate change is the second most desired cause in their jobs. And the net zero generation raised with technology seeks career opportunities that provide tech-based learning and growth, yet many industrial sectors like ours lag in digital adoption. So as a part of my job, when I visit technical institutes and management institute to hire young leaders for our organization, one of the questions I ask is, what is your dream company to work for? Unfortunately, none of them talk about steel companies, right? And hence, how are we changing the dialogue? How are we changing the perception? If this is the workers of tomorrow, how as industry leaders, as steel companies, we are looking at giving them what they are looking at. One of the studies conducted also shows, these are the top skills required for green jobs. While the core technical skills will be very, very important, but most of the importance is on the techno-functional skills or the softer skills, talking about communication, strategic leadership skills, environmental awareness and protection, analytical thinking. Because this article talks about once the employees have these skills, transitioning to any kind of technology will be much easier. And please keep in mind when I mention that most of the organizational transformation doesn't happen because of the employees' resistance to change. So more and more we equip our employees with this kind of skills, any kind of transformation or all kind of transformations will become much more easier than what it is today. Now let's look into how do we build the inclusive culture within the steel industry. The similar article by International Labour Organization talk about jobs created in circular economy by gender. And if you look into the graph, what it talks about is in the energy sustainable scenario, both job destruction and job creation in a circular economy are concentrated in male-dominated occupation. While there will be 24 million jobs created and 12 million jobs lost for women, however, it will not offset the prevailing gender employment inequality. Keeping that in mind, without any kind of policy intervention, transition will very probably create more employment opportunities for men than for women. So with a transition, with transformation, the gender inequality still remains the same. And hence, the gender gap. As a steel industry, we need to ensure women in all their diversity have leadership roles and seats in decision-making tables. Otherwise, all the numbers which is projected up on the slide, by 2050, only 30% of women will be in management positions. So how we are building steel organizations as inclusive organization, typically keeping gender in mind, and let's start with women first. Gen Zers will keep sustainability top of the mind. As I talked about in my previous slide, the eco-conscious Gen Z consumers not only make purchases based on their brand's ESG claim, they also may want to make employment decisions based on their personal sustainability beliefs. And over 50%, again, will consider leaving a job because of the company's net zero policies. So again, attracting the new talent, looking into the future, I think we have no other way but to work on it as soon as possible and helping our employees to make this transition. So the success mantra for future is building leaders for tomorrow, being more inclusive and building skills. Again, very quickly, my time is almost up. So attributes of the sustainable leaders, continuously building that up, build cross-geography functional experience for all our leadership team, develop transformational leaders with growth mindset, highly agile and inclusive leadership, and build policies and processes with multi-level delegation of authority. Let not be like the pyramid structure whenever it comes to a decision-making. And also be more inclusive by developing inclusive people policy, platforms for Gen Z and women in decision-making, gender-focused employment generation program, and make it a psychological safe place to work so that everybody openly can talk about their issues and their skills and what they need to perform better. Academic institute and industry partnership, I cannot emphasize less on this to build the curriculum of the future, early adoption of skills for women, and building a learning organization with focus of becoming the employer of choice. So when any of us goes to the campus and asks them what is your dream company to work for, let it be like, I want to be a part of the steel industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajanta. We will move on to the next speaker, Luis. He's going to talk about just transition assessment and the steel industry.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you to the previous speakers, and thank you to all of you. Hope you're still with us after lunch. Let me just test. Where is to move forward? The green one. Oh, the green one, of course. Okay, so I'm Luis Costa. I'm research lead for the World Benchmarking Alliance. Just started a few months ago, 6 months ago. And I'm going to talk to you about the just transition in the steel industry. Just very briefly for you that don't know us and what we do, the World Benchmarking Alliance is a non-profit organization that assesses 2,000 keystone companies in how they are doing in several domains of the transition. As you can see here, how they are doing in terms of their decarbonization, in terms of their respect to food and agriculture, how they respect biodiversity, how they're doing on digital rights and things like that. I will just talk about the decarbonization and energy side, and in particular of the steel industry, of course. But what do we intend to do with benchmarking companies, particularly keystone companies, which are kind of world leaders on the particular industry or very important regional players? What we want to do is to provide open source benchmarks, so open source data, where companies can see within their peers how good they are doing in regard to their climate targets, in regard to their just transition dealings, or any of these transformations. And in this sense, recognize leadership and corporate accountability to these companies. And of course, we want, as the Benchmarking Alliance name says, we are an alliance to realize the impact together with a multi-stakeholder alliance and bring these companies forward into the discussion. So just very briefly in terms of numbers, because we always like to show big numbers. So if we put all our 2,000 keystone companies, we kind of branch to 86 countries, 92 million people, tralala, many trillion euros in revenue. And we have kind of this global coverage that we're quite proud of. In regard to the yellow part that I will talk, shows just decarbonization and energy transformation. Our group assesses the 450 world's most influential companies in high-emitting sectors, so where you proudly belong. We call the climate and energy benchmark, and you can see an idea of the sectors that we evaluate. It's not only steel, it's also automotive, electric utilities, and so on. And just a few months ago, we published our heavy industries benchmark, the first benchmark I actually led on Waking the Giants, insights on decarbonization and just transition efforts in the heavy industries. And I want to focus this of climate performance and just transition. So our benchmark incorporates both of these dimensions. So all companies are assessed both on their climate performance, the usual stuff, their targets, their investments in low carbon, how they are doing in terms of investments, supply chain relations, building new business models. We do this with very dedicated sectoral methodologies. Developed by the ACT initiative, Accelerate Climate Transition. Some of you might be aware of this, but it's just sectoral methodologies that allow to compare companies and to evaluate them in regard to their climate performance. And then we have the thing that makes us a little bit proud and a little bit different. We combine this with a just transition assessment, part of a social assessment, but I will just focus on the just transition part, where we look at specific social, particular just transition indicators, such as are the companies providing or incorporating or welcome social dialogue from the beginning with unions, as Patrick mentioned? Are they performing just transition planning? Do they have an idea of how many green and decent jobs they want to create, how many people they need to reskill? Are they betting on social protection? Are they putting forward advocacy, lobbying for more just transition in their ecosystem of the industry? So this, I think, makes us unique on how we evaluate companies, because you can be top-notch on the climate targets, but if you're not engaging on social dialogue, you don't have a just transition plan, then you're downgraded. Another thing that makes us unique, or maybe not, is just we only use public data. So you might have the best climate plan and just transition plan in your pocket. If it's not outside, we don't see it, then you get 0. We do this through company reporting mostly, but also looking at your websites, at kind of presentations you put forward on the topic, and so on and so forth. And for the climate side, we have the help of CDP to help us with your targets and your disclosure, but only publicly available CDP reports. So only those are considered in our benchmark. So just in terms of what we did for the heavy industries, we didn't only look at steel, we also looked at your body cement and a little bit the new kids aluminium here. In total, we allocated, or we looked at 91 companies, 41 on iron and steel. And if you look at the amount of global steel production that we covered, by assessing these companies, it's about 37% and 28% of the global emissions. And if you sum all of the industries, we're talking about 3 million workers that are within these industries. So just very briefly, the highlights of what we found out just for the steel, for the heavy industries, in the terms of just transition, we found out that half of the companies score 0 in all of our just transition indicators, meaning that either there's no disclosure or they don't meet the indicator that is proposed of engaging on social dialogue or a plan for reskilling people. Meaning that the heavy industry sectors as a whole has still a long way to go to ensure that the just transition is embedded and taken on board. Only 4 companies score at least 20% of the available points, and only 19% of the assessed companies actually commit on engaging with social dialogue with the parties involved. But maybe more interesting for here is how then the different industries look and compare to each other. So we see the distribution of the scores, and I put some names there. It's always nice to see names and a scale, so then you can kind of start feeling vulnerable maybe, but from this position of vulnerability also making aware of where the problem lies and that you're not alone. So we see that overall, and maybe we skip aluminium because there was very few companies there. Just transition scores are pretty low, so we have a total scale of 20, and the best scoring performer industry that we had was aluminium, with an average of 2.2, the highest average. But if we look at the averages of the cement and steel industries, they are very, very bad. So they are below 1 point as an average, of course. But as you see, this is kind of, as we noticed and we pointed today, you're starting this journey, and you're definitely not alone here. And we can point some kind of better practices within the steel and cement and put some companies there. But even if you're a little bit more to this side of the scale, it's still not so amazing, because the scale should go until 20, and I cut it here at 14. So one exercise we do that we like to push forward is, even though the overall sector picture is not bright in terms of just transition, if you sum up all of the good practices of each company into a kind of a virtual steel company, which is what we put here as attainable score based on the best sectoral practices, you could actually move the whole sector quite a bit if you just learn from each other in what others are doing. If you take the example of just transition planning of one company, how the other company is doing on the gender balance, how the other company is doing on engaging with unions. So if you just look, you don't need to reinvent anything new. You just need to look what your peers are doing the best, and you can read our report for that. And then if you sum all the scores, you will be like around 8 instead of being below 1. So very quickly, what we found as good practice: frequent stakeholder engagement and collaboration. There are companies that actually have a global idea on how to implement transition efforts at specific locations, not just very broadly as a group. Impact awareness by understanding impacts through the value chain. Focus on human rights with specific measures to prevent direct and indirect adverse impacts to workers and communities. And of course, corporate alignment and alignment between lobbying efforts and just transition. So very quickly, here are some typical challenges that we see from companies. Workforce reskilling and retraining. There's quite a big challenge on this, on how companies go about it. Lack of worker involvement and social dialogue, pointing to what Patrick said in the beginning. Potential job losses and impacts on local communities and how to mitigate these. Financing the whole transition requires massive investments, and there's a significant financial burden on steel companies that are operating sometimes on tight margins. And of course, policy uncertainty and lack of coherent standards, as we looked at today, the case of green steel, and this was pretty much already emphasized here. So it's a bit not a good picture, but as I said, you're not only alone in your sector, you're also not alone compared with other sectors, because we do this across other sectors. The best example we have are the electric utilities. Here we do have higher scores. We do have companies that are far more ahead because they started early, they believe on the transition, they have invested for it, and they are the kind of front runners so that others can also decarbonize. But if you look at sectors like oil and gas, the picture is pretty much dim also. So it's kind of not only a steel sector problem or challenge, it's also a cross-sectoral challenge. So that brings me to the last slide. Sorry for being a bit over time. I talked about a lot about the just transition part in steel, but we also have the climate part, which is actually the part that I come from. And if you want to know also a little bit about this, you can also see our report, where you also have the climate performance in combination with the just transition one. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Luis. There was a lot of information, a lot of interesting data. We will receive questions later on. So let me introduce Sangeet as the last speaker of the session. He's coming from the finance sector, so he will talk about how finance can drive and accelerate the just transition in the steel industry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to the WSA for inviting me, and also for putting this topic on the agenda. And I think hopefully we're able to make something of a case for why steel companies should continue to think about this in the years to come. So I'm Sangeet Rajaselvaraju. I'm a sustainable finance analyst at the Just Transition Finance Lab. We're hosted at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the lab in a little bit as to what we're doing there. Some of the other panelists have already covered why just transition has been an issue. Sue already said the OECD has mentioned it, but just transition has been part of the climate discussion from the very beginning, actually. In Paris, it's mentioned right from the start in 2015. And as of last year, this has become a real leadership issue also at COP28 last year, where there's now a Just Transition Work Program, there are Just Transition Working Groups, and it's part of the UNFCCC process already. In addition to the goals that are there for climate targets, the second half of those sentences are now in a fair, just, and inclusive way. So it's triple renewables in a fair, just, and inclusive way, phase out, phase down of fossil fuels in a fair, just, and inclusive way. So I think it's something that's become very much part and parcel of the leadership issue, but also something that's really come to the fore. And so the LSE's Just Transition Finance Lab has been created as a place for experimentation to do that. Investors have started to support the Just Transition in many ways and started launching initiatives. I'll cover that in a little bit. And Asia will be one of those crucial areas for climate in general. I think I like to say the swing states of climate and our climate budget are in Asia. And from John's presentation yesterday, I think that's only too clear for the steel sector as well when we think about the carbon budget. So where are we in the financial system? So this is data from the Financial Stability Board. There's around $500 trillion of assets in the global financial system. About 4% of those assets lie in emerging markets. This figure is excluding China. So given that the greatest need of transition and the accelerated transition is in emerging markets, I think what this clearly shows is they just don't have the capital base to go about financing what that transition looks like. So there's different actors within the financial system that have started taking action on just transition. National public finance programs from regions in Spain, India, the US have started to have elements of just transition embedded in how they're doing policy. Institutional investors have got together in initiatives like the Climate Action 100. The Climate Action 100 is a group of 700 institutional investors with assets under management of about $60 trillion. They analyze about 170 of the most polluting companies in the world, which cover about 60 to 70% of global emissions. And they assess these companies on a range of 10 benchmarks. Benchmarks like long-term greenhouse gas, net zero targets, capital allocation towards them. And as of last year, just transition is one of those criteria. These investors engage these corporates on all of those targets annually. And like Luis was mentioning from the World Benchmarking Alliance numbers, it's similar for the steel companies in the Climate Action 100, who are in the top 170 in Climate Action 100. They all score quite poorly. So I think it's a starting issue, and there's a report that's linked that I can share on these assessments. Multilateral development banks have just transition programs now. The ADB in Indonesia, also through its ETM mechanism. Commercial banks have started to have just transition criteria with social criteria, particularly in the debt markets, in GSS bond issuance. As of last year, almost $1 trillion of green social sustainability linked bonds were issued. Many of them have many social criteria. And then finally, international partnerships. Many of you might have heard of the JETPs. There's 4 countries with JETPs now, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. And just as being a key part of the financing for that. So what does the lab do? So my colleague, Nick Robbins, has been working on setting the agenda for just transition for the last 5 or 6 years. As we've said, it's taken up. But part of the issue of working with institutional investors, banks, and corporates is they ask us, what do you do about it? How do you measure it? What kind of instruments are out there for it? So and I think as we've realized, this is something that we have to do in collaboration. This is simply not a one-man act. We need help from all of you to think about outside the box and how we move on this topic. So the lab has been created as a neutral place at a university for convening and experimenting on what can be done to move on this. So we work on financial instruments and strategies, bonds, transition plans. We work on metrics. How do you measure this? We've done a compendium of just transition criteria metrics from corporate disclosure regimes, comparing 13 global corporate disclosure regimes. We do real-world case studies. We've got a case study of a Scottish utility company and an Indian renewables company now, IANA and SSE, and of course policy. So this is what the lab does. And what can investors do on just transition? So a couple of years ago, along with the International Labour Organization, we released guidance and tools for banks and institutional investors on what investors can ask for in just transition from their corporate. So one is plans include just transition principles in their net zero plans. These principles have already been agreed, so ask corporates to start thinking about this, engage corporates on this through initiatives like Climate Action 100, allocate, whether it's the bond market or the SLL market, and other channels, and advocate for policy change that they already do, and last, disclose, be accountable for just transition in their reporting. So what does this mean in the steel industry? I think there has been, industrial transitions have been disorderly. And I think that's been a big part of why it's come to the fore and been known as unjust transitions in the steel industry. It's a question mark of how we start thinking about this. So I think the case in point has been Port Talbot in the UK. It's really got national attention and very much in the context of an unjust transition. And from our interactions and thinking about what it means to have a more just transition, the one thing we've taken away from all actors is that this was the worst place to start thinking about a just transition. Fundamentally, what does that mean? I think it's that we have to anticipate the transitions that are naturally going to be disorderly and that have these impacts, to start planning well in advance what that means and take all those communities along in part of those conversations. And otherwise, we will have a repeat of this on and on. This is going to be particularly the case in Europe. In the UK, for example, Port Talbot, when it goes offline, will be 1.5% of UK emissions. This year, the UK will have 3% of its emissions offline with Scunthorpe, with oil and gas, Grangemouth refinery. So I think there's more of this to come unless we start thinking about planning for what this means. What can investors do? What should corporates do? I think we need an industrial strategy, right, that achieves economic, social, environmental goals, where state support is tied to not just net zero, but net zero with people. And that needs to be part of how we start thinking about how we plan this. There needs to be anticipation. What we were saying with planning, there needs to be facility level and corporate transition plans which embed just transition. We've started doing work on the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK. Transition planning as a regulatory requirement is coming up across the world. It's on the G20 agenda this year. For Brazil, we've started finding ways that we can embed social indicators and just transition indicators within corporate transition plans. And I think that's one way we can do that. And the last is green steel social contracts. And this is something that's emerging of long negotiations and conversations of unions and steel companies in SSAB or the Netherlands. And by no means is this a sign to say this was perfect and this is how this is the template for how you do just transition planning for the steel sector. But we have to start there, and we have to start early if we want to have a chance at it. And the last is mobilizing finance. And investors such as pension funds, who were amongst the first to move on just transition, because they represent workers. Stewards of capital, asset managers are basically mostly managing pension funds, and they are very interested in this. And banks and national champions who are banks and domestic infrastructure banks obviously have roles to play in this as well. So I think this has been one part of just transition which Sue's laid out, which is on the more micro level. And I think there's maybe one other part, which maybe a colleague yesterday on the panel said about maybe where capacity is coming up and what there is a global dimension to this just transition as well, of where capital lies, where, as I said in the second slide, and 4% of assets are in EMs. This is a chart from the OECD's report this year on capacity, new capacity that's coming up. Again, added on, reinforced by what John said yesterday. New coal capacity is coming up in India, in ASEAN, and they don't have the capital base for it. I have a slide in the appendix here that you can see, as of just last year, Germany has given more than 5 or 6 billion euros in capex subsidies for green steel projects, which is a good thing. 4 billion in CCFDs and OPEX support, with 20 billion outlined for the next 10 years for steel, cement, and glass. The entire Indian PLI scheme, which is the Indian version of IRA, is 24 billion over a period of 10 years that covers 14 industries, from everything that goes from drones to critical raw minerals to batteries. So they don't have the fiscal space to cover the incremental costs. And if you want to talk about this in a global way, we have to address this issue. And the other part is a lot of the other sectors within the largest increase in this in India. 40% of the current steel production happens through medium, small sector enterprises there. The small players who are doing DRI, who will become a smaller share, and the hope that they will disappear as the industry grows would be another reflection of just how unjust this transition would be. We have a report on what the financing needs for that are that came out last year, and they're also incredibly high. So I think these are things that we have to start again planning, not just at a plant level or a project level, but globally. And so we need a globally just approach, for how countries with limited fiscal space go about taking part in this transition as well. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Sue, that's me.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we hear a lot of different perspectives from different stakeholders, different institutions. Let's start the panel discussion on this topic. Can you put the screen of Patrick? Yes. Before I ask the floor to ask a question to the speakers, I will start with my question to Patrick. Patrick mentioned that workers should be integral part in the planning and decision-making process for just a transition. From the union's point of view, what does an effective just transition process look like?
Thank you, Sue. A just transition process for unions takes a number of elements, because we know that the low carbon economy poses a lot of challenges for the steelworkers, including new risks. As I said, the risks are like a job displacement, the need for new skill sets, and also some economic uncertainty. So for this transition, for the unions, the main point is that the workers are the core of the process, are involved since the beginning. It's part of all the just transitions, I would say, guidelines, that if we want to have a just transition, is that actually the ones that are producing the steel are actually involved since the beginning of the process, are involved in the changing and in the choices of the changes. And that's the main problem we're facing so far, is was said in Port Talbot and other cases we have everywhere in Europe and the world. For the moment, the unions and workers are not involved in the process. That's why there is no just transition so far. We are only involved in the consequences, and we have to deal only with the consequences of a choice where we're not involved in. To have a just transition, accepted the fact that the union should be in the heart of a process and the workers should be in the heart of a process. We must have what we call the robust social safety nets. We know that the workers will be displaced during this transition phase. So we must have comprehensive employment benefits to provide financial stability during this period of job losses. Healthcare must be ensured for the workers, their families, for the communities. But eventually we must provide also some benefits, some secure retirement benefits for the ones that have no possibility to be re-employed or to have the training and reskilling problems, especially the seniors. And we see in some other countries the question of the employability of the seniors are really now a huge problems, because especially in the steel sector. So these programs of secure retirement benefits for us are also very important. The training and reskilling programs, as you have said, I mean, many of you said, well, is actually part of what we call in the heart of the transition, because we know that we'll have a new jobs, that we'll need new skills, that we need also new educations and quality and new vocational trainings. So that's why we need also these programs of skilling and reskilling the workers in the transition. And many we have seen in some of the cases, there was no training and reskilling programs that were offered, nor by the governments or nor by also the multinational corporations. So that's why I think they are facing some really key challenges in having qualified workers. And when we saw also the question of training and reskilling programs, when you get new jobs, I would put here also the question of wages. If the wages are not at the level that are supposed to be with these new skilling and reskilling programs, there's no way the workers will want to work in the steel industry. And we see that already in many companies already, or in Europe or all over the world. We have problems of finding workers to want to work for the steel industry because of the wages. So the question of redistribution is really a key element if you want to have also a transition from the steel industry and have a capacity to produce steel. So behind that, we have also the question of funding the transition. And for us, for the unions, the cost of this transition must be borne equitably. At this stage, we must just regret that the multinational corporations are trying to profit from the state aids and trying to get state aids instead of contributing from themselves to these transitions. So we see many cases, what we call blackmail from the multinational corporation to get the most public granting, and we threaten make it to fret about job losses if they don't get this granting. And for us, this is just unacceptable, this kind of blackmail. This kind of multinationals are today making the billions of profits, and at the moment they are not willing to contribute to this transition. And for us, the transition not only lies on the back of the workers and the communities and states. So this has to be shared equitably, and we regret at the moment that it's not taking place. I will stop by here, I think, Sue. But I mean, for us, the main questions around all these issues, I mean, is really if we want to have a good transition, a fair transition, a just transition, is that the workers are put since the beginning, are a partner in the process. And so far, the workers and unions are not part of the process. That's why we think there is not a just transition. For my last phrase on that, the workers and unions sometimes know better the plant and the steel industry than some of the leaders of a company. So the question is how the leaders of a company are now listening to workers, because they know how to make the changes, how to make the transitions. And the transition without workers will never happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. What you described is the kind of lessons for us to learn for the transitions we are going to make in the future. So thank you very much for sharing those valuable information. Before I turn to the floor, I have another question to one of the speakers. Louise, the information you shared with us is really interesting, but also eye-opening. And we are kind of a bit disappointed that we're not doing very well in this topic, but kind of knew that because we just started our journey on this. Based on your assessment, are there any noticeable trend or patterns that you see from steel companies, how they are approaching the issue of just transition, apart from being scoring low in the assessment?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, indeed, it's a bit, I mean, we were expecting these results, and I also compared with other sectors, so it's just to make it clear that everyone is taking the first steps. I think there are good and there are positive signs, and there are also kind of, worrying trends, I would say persisting trends. I think Patrick really emphasized one, that is the apparently lack of dialogue from the beginning, this issue of anticipation before the decision is taken or planning for that. I think it's a kind of a stagnating trend, that it hasn't moved. Maybe it didn't have time to move yet, of course, as we are getting more aware. Also, the issue on the reskilling and potential jobs lost. That's also something that we don't see any movement on. Also, the cement companies or the aluminium companies we looked at, or the aluminium is more specific. We don't see a trend on how to tackle that. There are positive signs. There are some companies that do have just transition plans and starting to implement them. They are very, very few and very, very fragmented. Another positive, I think, sign is that. Or a big opportunity there, I think, is companies are doing already, also the steel ones, I would say relatively okay in starting to build their climate or carbon transition plans. And I think many of the elements there provide some of the key questions to what we are asking here. So if you know which plants you will move offline, then it's quite simple, I would say, at least to attach or to inform the workers about the change that is coming there, and do a small analysis on how many people will be affected. What should I do with these employees there? I mean, I see climate plans from your companies that say, oh, the carbon price will be so much in this year, therefore our cost will be so much in this year, therefore I need to do this and this investments in order to make it. So if you can do this, for me, it seems a relatively small step, just even for now, just to include an annex of just transition. You don't need to call it a plan. An annex saying, okay, if my climate trajectory, if my technological changes be like this, I expect these amount of people within my industry to be affected. Just that would move you much closer to something of an action plan. So I think you can leverage on what you do already on the climate side, because you have the technological change there, you have the legal frameworks that are changing there. You account for this already relatively good, some of you very good. So I know it has a long tradition, the climate transition planning or how to deal with this, but there's so many elements there, quantitative and qualitative, that you could just, I think, simply bridge to say, okay, then what is the consequences for my workers? And if you have an idea how many of these jobs will need to be, people will need to be retrained or moved, then you can play on the anticipation game and linking to Patrick, then you can put forward, okay, this is what will happen in 2026, because you know this will happen in the technological side. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and this is not also, I think, being taken up so far from any industry that we've seen for that matter in terms of just transition.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ajanta, let's take the industry's perspective. As we've seen the examples of the UK and some of our member companies' transition process, job losses, job changes are kind of inevitable during the transition process. How do you think the steel industry should address these job losses, changes, but also creation of new jobs due to the transition? And then what role the education and training program plays in supporting them?
Yeah, I guess for any industrial transformation, people capability is the key. So the more skilled people we have to manage the transformation, the success rate is much, much higher. So in India, we have this word called jugaad, jugaad technology, which means when the time comes, we will see, right? So I guess if we are, that has been traditionally the way to work. When the time comes, we will see. Unfortunately, that will not work, with all the transformation coming in. And hence, as a steel industry, we have to be proactive in building the capability which is required for this transformation. We have to work right now. We have to look at what is the technology which we are going to adopt, and as you rightly mentioned, and if that is the way to go forward, what percentage of my workforce will be affected, and how do we move forward? As I was giving an example that from the recruitment and from the hiring perspective, the plants are currently asked for environmental engineers more than metallurgy or mechanical engineers. So the ask is already moving into that direction. And hence, within the organization, we have to be extremely mindful and have a proactive plan of building capability. This will be very, very important. And also with the newer generation coming in and the leadership team in most of the steel companies retiring, so how do we build that capability within and manage the generation gap, which will come into fore very, very soon, within the industry. So to your question, I think it is extremely important and we need to do it immediately. Now.
Okay. I have one question to Sangeet. As you said, the finance has a key role to play in the just transition. What are the major challenges you see for just transition finance for the steel industries?
Thank you. So I think part of this is the view of just transition is simply as a risk alone, right? I think there is a risk element to just transition, but there is also an opportunity element of just transition, something that I think we are simply not emphasizing. There is transition will be slower if it's not just. Right? And I think that is why it's a leadership issue now, and finance realizes that. I think part of the challenge has been that it cannot become another compliance thing, that you tick box some more just transition criteria in your annual report or your corporate disclosure regime, and it gets picked up in some benchmark, and great. We've got to start thinking about this not as a separate thing that you have to do in terms of compliance. It's got to be part of the business thinking, and this is what we mean by the anticipation and the planning, which requires the conversation with everybody, right? And I think when that is there's clarity for investors to say, okay, what are we investing in, right? Now, this is not to say that if these projects and these investments had positive NPVs without any other outside support, they would be getting the money. They're not. Right? We're not saying that this is going to be something that this is happening because these projects can make money, but they're not. They need support, right? And that's why support is being given. It's how do we structure this support, right? That takes in the social contract of what this support means. It's taxpayer money, right? And you need it for the incremental cost. So no one is saying this is not. So I think part of what finance needs is to say, here's the kind of support we need to have a plan that's this ambitious, right? That looks like this. And like Lewis was saying, this is our technology. These are our 2 technology choice pathways, right? If these are the conditions, this is what it means. And in that context, these will be the workers that we've kept. And I'd just like to add one point on that this is not the first time the steel industry has done this. Right? The steel industry has had, if you look at the job chart of how many people have been employed in the steel industry, historically it's fallen, right? Sometimes not done well, and in instances done very well. And I'll just give one example of Tata Steel in Jamshedpur, right? In the 1990s, Tata Steel employed something like 90,000 people in their plant in Jamshedpur. 10 years later, it was about 25 to 30,000 people, right? Without a single industrial action, right? A corporate that's held by 30–40% charities as shareholders, right, has engaged, found voluntary retirement for some of them, repurposed. So there are ways, right? And that was entirely an efficiency decision, not a climate decision. And I think companies are probably starting to think about this, right? But I think we need to accelerate that given that the transition is here and that the time is limited. And I think even that's clear, investors will come. And I think that's part of what they're asking for through the plans, bond frameworks, etc., that I highlighted in my presentation.
Okay, thank you. It's also about transparency and our planning and the inclusive of the stakeholders. So let's start getting questions from the floor. Edwin, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks. So this is actually to Sangeet, and particularly to the last point in discussion that you made. Yes, I agree that historically our industry have many examples of where efficiency have led us to do things in imaginative ways, one of them being the example that you mentioned. The question that I have really is in terms of, I think you mentioned in your presentation, 4% of financial resources that you were looking at sits in developing economies, or developing economies. And these are really the locations where somehow a lot of work has to be done in terms of this transition process that we're talking about. How do you see this process of transition, of funding availability that sits 96% in the wrong place to go to the other places? You know, because just NPV values is not going to facilitate that transition of funding. What's the extra lever or two that we need to think about to move the funding into the developing world, where there's a real need also for transition?
Are we collecting or should I? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Edwin. Always the easy questions. I think this is as part of the broader, the UNFCCC kind of estimates, or the numbers are from Nick Stern and Vera Songwei, and say they have the 5 trillion you need annual on global investment in clean energy. 2.4 of that needs to go to emerging market developing economies, ex-China. 1 trillion of that has to come from outside those countries, in that they will be able to mobilize domestic resources of about 1.4. So we're talking about 1 trillion that needs to go into emerging markets. If you look at the numbers last year from the Bloomberg BNEF, about sub 10% of the 1.8 trillion that was spent on clean energy went to EMs. So your point, right? I think there is a part of this that is definitely we need more concessional lending, right? And of that 1 trillion that they have put in as part of the NCQG negotiations this year later, half of that is supposed to come from the MDBs, according to their estimate. So that's one part of it. And then the other half is private. The way we have gone to define transition, right? We have single global pathways on how transition is currently measured in terms of how our lines go down to 2050. That's just not the case in those parts of the world. And we have to acknowledge that how do we regionalize the sectoral pathways for these places? That's not to say that we give them a bigger carbon budget, right? But I think somebody asked a question on how do we have dynamic effects in this. But we need to give them a bit more time on for them to be able to kick in on some of these dynamic effects. And a lot of the private finance will not go or will not touch it because it doesn't align with those metrics. So I think we need to start thinking about how do we enable institutional investors in Europe, commercial banks, who are now tied in some ways to some of these pathways that they're investing in, that they have to report on, that they have regulatory responsibilities on here. How do we give them the opportunity to, I think, invest in these growing economies, right? But acknowledging, right, that there has to be some differentiation in what that pathway, without changing the area under the curve, right? And I think that's the point. Yeah.
Yes, there's a gentleman on the right side.
Thanks so much. When we talk about this just transition, there is the one coin or two sides for the just concept. One is the just development. For every business, every country can join the just rights for the green steel development, for green development. The second is distribution just. However, our speakers, our panelists only care about the distribution just, but we should pay more attention to the development just, not only the distribution, because currently, when we talk about green steel, green development, we have a huge gap for steel segment. We have a huge gap for 1.5 degree. So you really, to make this distribution just all care so much about workers or standards or damage the steel industry, will damage maybe 2/3 of the developing countries' development. Also will refuse all the maybe 3 billion or 4 billion populations industrialization or developmental just. So we should actually, particularly for just transition, we should particularly maybe particularly if we can find that for distribution just, we have very limited finance this year, very limited actually time for 1.5 degree, and very limited actually the technology knowledge resources. For actually, my suggestion, we should pay more attention to the development just. This means maybe from DR Congo to India, Bangladesh, I think this country should join, maybe have the access to the free green steel technology transfer, or we can to create a huge green steel market, maybe from currently billion level to trillion level. We can create a huge just market for all developing countries. Like these countries on business join just development rights. So this is my suggestion. Put the development just as a top priority, not just to use some weapons to damage our industry. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a comment that I don't know how to respond. So if anybody can, from our speakers, anybody want to respond to that comment?
No, I think it's a very just comment by saying that, why don't we kind of just develop, so the transition is also about just development. So I guess I just agree to that comment, how we can use the resources of development and then, kind of make it free, make the knowledge kind of more encompassing and make it more available to everybody within the steel industry.
We are all from different part of the world. We represent different stakeholders, so we have different perspectives and viewpoint on this topic. So I just appreciate that you sharing your point and that we listen. We are here to listen and to learn. I see another hand up there.
Thanks. So I guess, is Patrick still here?
Yeah, Patrick is there. Patrick, can you put your camera on, please?
I guess so. This is more of a question towards him. But if I could summarize a lot of my thinking today, it's been I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. And when it comes to just transition and the relationship between workers and industry, we obviously have 150 years worth of experience in dealing with how to get better wages and how to also get better transition conditions and better conditions for workers, and it doesn't tend to be by asking politely. So it tends to be by the strength of unions and the strength of workers' movements. And one group I see very much missing in this environment and this hall is workers' representation. So I wonder, like, maybe that's something, a takeaway for Open Forum for next year is, like, potentially have more representation from the steelworkers themselves and from unions. And I wanted to ask Patrick, like, what do you see the role of anti-union laws that have been very much a prominent factor in the last 40 years of industrial development? Like, how do you see them, union busting and union busting laws being a problem for that relationship between industry and workers, and maybe how we could change that to help just transition?
Thank you very much for this question. I think it's not only union busting, it's also the labor reforms that have been adopted in the past 20 years that have attacked the capacities of unions to be part of the processes, attacked the collective actions of the unions and workers. So, of course, we have leverages in terms of now dealing with union busting. We now, for example, the due diligence laws that have been adopted in many European countries, but also now by the European Parliament. So I guess it will be new challenges now to deal with the question of union busting. But nevertheless, we have to also to figure out that even if we have union busting, we have also in companies the question of social dialogue. And I think for us, in the main steel companies, what we are dealing with, they are large companies. We have dialogue with them, but we see that the quality of social dialogue has now been reducing by a lot in the past years. What we call now partners, our unions were partners in these companies now don't just to be only, I would say, not even partners. They are just part of meetings where the unions and workers are not listening. We're just giving them I would say few attention. So yeah, I mean, we see that the union busting is something that still exists, but we have now leverages, and more we are seeing that we have improvement in mainly even in countries where we used to have this union busting. So we have now capacities to attack the multinationals that are doing that, the legislation that are doing that. We are using the due diligence. We are using also the global framework agreement we have, but now also tackling the question of unionization, not only in the multinational, but also in the whole supply chain. So it's also linked to the steel companies that are part of the industry supply chain. So we are dealing with that. So we have now leverages. We have learned from the past, but I mean, for our main concern, it's really to the question of transition. As you're saying, the transition is not something new. It's something that always takes place since the creation of industry and the different industrial revolution. But in the different industrial revolutions, I mean, many of the workers are already part of a process in trying to deal with the transformation, try to deal with also the how to share the profit, how to share the new systems of productivity to improve the systems. But now, in this transformation we're facing now, we are very worried because the workers and unions are not part of the process at all. That has been said for some of the people that are part of the panel. So beating behind that and behind the question of just transition is the question of social dialogue itself that now we are putting on the table. The question of discussing with unions and workers for us is not a question of social dialogue. It's not only social dialogue. Social dialogue is taking the unions and workers as partners. We've seen too many companies telling us we are having so many hours of meeting with the unions. We have plenty of cases like this. But in the fact, when you look at the reality, they are not listening. The only thing that the employers and multinationals are saying is just to explain why they are doing this and not listening to the workers. And the workers sometimes are just giving them telling them what would happen with the choices, the consequences of a choice of the multinationals are taking. And some of the times the multinationals are just not listening, and at the end the workers are right about the consequences. So because I was telling you, sometimes the workers know better the steel plant and the steel industry than the leaders of a company itself. So we just want to pay the attention that social dialogue is not only a question of taking time just to explain what you want. It's also taking the unions on board as true partners. And this question of partnership is now, in the last past 10 years, has been reducing by a lot. So I'm stopping here. Sometimes difficult to talk online. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we're running out of time. If there's no further questions, I will close the session. But what we learned today from this conversation will be with us, and we will make our progress on this topic. And then I hope that our members come on board to continue the discussions and then lessons learned to take into action for the steel industry. Thank you very much for listening to us and then sharing your thought. And let's continue the conversation. Thank you.